really supported and still support the war to get rid of a dictator. But are you really optimistic that this is going to end well for the people of Iraq?
Well, look, Iraq is a maimed and traumatized country which had been allowed to decay, was one of my reasons for supporting the intervention, under Saddam Hussein and sanctions combined, to a point where it had practically imploded as a society. And the longer that status quo went on, the more something like this was likely to be the outcome. And one can't undo the damage done to a society by 3.5 decades of war and fascism in a short time.
We spoke last night to the former Defence Minister Ali Alawi, a man I know that you admire. He argues that the General Petraeus report is designed pretty much solely for a Washington audience and ignores the fact that there are now millions of internally displaced refugees huddling, as he says, in ethnic enclaves, and that political reconciliation, you pointed to this yourself, has collapsed, and that there's a corresponding rise of tribalism. All of this points to a very grim and unravelling future. And
he could have added that there's an additional dimension to that tragedy, which is that we don't know the exact figures, but many tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, tending to be the more qualified and gifted ones, have fled across the border, either into Jordan or into Syria, so that the large parts of the country are being abandoned to the most backward and fearful elements. One could go on and say that one reason why Baghdad is a bit quieter now than it was the same time last year is that last year the business of ethnic cleansing was at its height, and the Shia militias more or less succeeded in imposing their will on a large part of Baghdad. So of course they've gone a bit quieter because they've got what they wanted.
So Alawi is posing the obvious question: what's the plan? What's the American-backed plan for the Iraqi state? What kind of state are we going to end up with?
Well, the offer... I am sorry, I have a frog in my throat.
That's all right.
The offer made was a federal constitution where differences will be settled through Parliament and by elections. Well, that's still a fair offer, but there aren't enough politically sincere, secular, democratically minded Iraqis to take the offer up. Everyone interprets it as a way of securing a power grab or a share in the spoils for their own faction. That's the tragedy of the situation. That's also the outcome of 35 years of divide and rule and the obliteration of political culture, so that with the exception of a very few people, like I would say President Jalal Talabani himself, who could be a good politician in any country, the political class in Iraq is very largely made up of people who are very petty, very mediocre. That's not going to change in a short time. And they may, bad as they are, they may not be as sectarian as much of their electorate is. With the single and rather shining exception of the northern provinces of Kurdistan, which is why I keep insisting that you don't leave them out, where the Kurds have stopped fighting each other, which they used to do. They've composed their own differences, showing that people can come to their senses, where the religious parties don't have much of a toehold, where there is an open society and more or less freedom from fear, where they've just opened an American University of Iraq. The first branch is open in Sulaymaniyah. So with the exception of that, everything you say is an understatement of how gruesome the reality is and how terrifying the future is. It could be a really Hobbesian collapse of a society.
Indeed, and
that would unfailingly lead to foreign intervention, not this time from democratic countries, but from Saudi Arabia, Iran, and quite possibly Turkey. So if you think it's bad now, you've given no idea of how bad it could be.
It's of course hard not to make the obvious observation that were it not for the invasion, were it not for the failed American plans after the occupation, that wouldn't be the case.
I don't know. That would involve saying that if Iraq had persisted under the Saddam plus sanctions pre-existing status quo, that it would now be a unified and harmonious society, a stable if cruel. That's nonsense. I mean, this is all the outcome of letting Iraq rot for far too long, of not taking the bull by the horns in 1991.
Well, listening to what you're saying about Kurdistan does point to one possible solution, that many US analysts are starting to come to this conclusion, that Iraq will inevitably be partitioned, something like the former Yugoslavia, into a series of probably 3 mini-states. Do you support that idea?
Well, the two books to read are one, Mr. Alawi's book, the gentleman you just mentioned, I think, and the other is Peter Galbraith's book, The End of Iraq. Peter probably knows the country better than almost any other American, but particularly close with the Kurds for a very long time, was one of the few people on the left like myself who did think it was necessary to start Iraq again without Saddam Hussein, which I still think was a sine qua non. Well, he thinks that we should now announce that the state of Iraq has failed and that it should be partitioned. And he makes a very, very persuasive case for a 3-state solution. My reservation about that is this. I'm not sure it would stop at 3. I think there would be internecine fighting between Kurds and Shia, between Shia and Sunni, among them, I mean, not between them, as there already is in Basra. There are fights between pro-Iranian militias and between pro-Baghdad ones, for example.
Which, as you say,
the thing about partition,
which as you say, and which the Americans clearly are worried about, would potentially lead to an Iranian intervention, a direct Iranian intervention.
And a Saudi one in the case of the Sunnis, yes. Yeah. That's already happening, of course, but it would intensify. I mean, I've written a lot about partition as a historical subject, as a legacy of British Empire. And one thing you notice about it is it always leads to another partition. It never stops with the first one. It becomes cantonization if you're not careful. You'll be partitioned down to fiefdoms the size of a city block, in the case of Baghdad or Basra, perhaps. Remember, Pakistan was repartitioned. Bangladesh broke away. The partition of Palestine has to be redone all the time. Bosnia was another case where cantonization impended, and there would have been a war of all against all. It was actually worth keeping Bosnia going as a unitary state.
Okay, Christopher, sorry to interrupt you there, because I just want to. I want a concluding.
Rambling on about partition.
No, it's very important. But I want to conclude here with this idea that all of this poses an immense problem for the nations that have got themselves bound up in the future of Iraq, the coalition of the willing nations who all say they won't leave until, or can't leave until there's some sort of stability, and indeed until there's a functioning Iraqi security force that can actually do the job for their troops. Now, what Ali Alawi says is, without a unified state, there won't be a unified military force, ever. That does really pose the question as to whether all these countries will have permanent interventions in Iraq.
Yes, well, to borrow from what you said to me in your question, I think the beginning of wisdom is to recognize that it was always the case that we were bound up in the future of Iraq. People describe this as a war of choice or as a decision to intervene. We were always involved with Iraq. Not only were we always involved with it, we were always responsible for the state of affairs there because of a long history of, on the whole, rather bad statecraft. So the fact is, a maimed and wrecked Iraq was in our future no matter what. And it's going to stay in our future no matter what. I would have thought the beginning of wisdom, to repeat myself, is to realize there's no such thing as leaving it. You can't dump it. It would be like pretending it wasn't on the map at all.
Christopher Hitchens, there's probably another hour of conversation here easily to go on.
Sure.
We'll have to come back to it because we can't keep going now, unfortunately. We thank you very much for taking the time again early in the morning, your time in Washington, to come and join us. We'll see you again soon, we hope.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.